This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
This episode is brought to you by Cornell Studio Supply, located in the gem city of Dayton, Ohio. Find all your pottery and ceramic sculpture equipment and supplies with the best customer service and world-class workshops. Join us January 16th through the 18th, 2026 for a colored clay and material inclusion workshop with Chris Alvashir and Jillian Park. Visit CornellStudioSupply.com to sign up. Cornell Studio Supply, owned and operated for potters by potters.
This episode is sponsored by Monkey Stuff. Monkey Stuff makes things for makers. We're inspired every day by the craft and creativity of makers and design and manufacture tools and accessories to try to make your making life a bit more delightful. Our products are designed in California, by makers and for makers, and manufactured in the USA. Check out our line of pottery accessories and tools at monkeystuff.com. Follow us on Instagram to see what we're up to in our studios, and keep on making great things.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 556 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. This week, we're continuing a two-part interview with renowned artist and educator David MacDonald. In this part of our interview, we talk about how he found a portal into African aesthetics, the formal aspects of his repeating patterns, and how the use of functional objects in daily rituals can imbue them with spirituality. MacDonald is a professor emeritus of ceramics at Syracuse University, where he taught from 1971 to 2008. That's also the location of the Everson Museum, which is one of the preeminent ceramic collections in the United States, featuring many of David's vessels. If you're in that area, definitely go and check that out. It is kind of mind-blowing to see all of that work in a beautiful building designed by I.M. Pei. Also wanted to thank Lindsay Rogers and the staff of Aramont for putting on the Utilitarian Clay Conference. David was a presenter this year, and I got to be a part of the conference as well. So I appreciate them providing a space to do this interview. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Yeah, I had a question about the ramifications of the slave trade, because that was a massive disconnect culturally. Like you mentioned, there was a lot of erasure of people's cultural customs. But fast forward hundreds of years to you as a 20-something or 30-something man looking to the African continent and to the art of the diaspora as a whole, you were reconnecting. How did you find a place to reconnect? Like you as an American kid growing up in Hackensack, New Jersey, how did you connect then back to art from the continent when you were starting to look at that?
Well, I think one of the things that helped me to connect was that catalog from the Metropolitan Museum of Nigerian ceramics, because that was a portal into African culture that I could understand both technically, primarily, but also in the sense that all of these things, well, most of them, I mean, there were a few sculptural pieces that were small figurines, but most of them were vessels. And the idea that I had early on developed an affinity towards the vessel and towards the notion of utility. So being able to see that there was a group of people or potters in an entirely different culture that were wrestling and solving similar kinds of problems that I was as a potter in the United States. Also, the fact that one of the things that I found incredibly fascinating about at least Nigerian ceramics is that they decorated everything, and we tend to think of, or at least Westerners tend to think of Africa as being this monolith, but Africa is probably ethnologically more diverse than Europe ever was, and a country like Nigeria has three primary ethnic groups, Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba, but there are other much smaller ethnicities or tribal groups that are also involved. And so just looking at the pottery that each of these groups made and seeing the differences, I found completely amazing as well. And so I remember doing a workshop at Haystacks Mountain School of Arts and Crafts, and we had this session. It was a special session that was organized by Winnie Owens Hart, and what it was all of the presenters, all of the people that were conducting the classes were people that were African Americans and people who were using their African heritage as their primary source of inspiration. Okay. And they were mostly white people who registered for the various classes, and so there were classes in metalsmithing, classes in woodworking, classes. I taught the one in ceramics and fibers and so on and so forth. And towards the end of the session, there was an opportunity for each of the teachers to do a slide presentation. And so I gave a slide presentation of my work, and it chronicled my earlier work, and that was primarily political, and to my later work at that time. And I think this was probably maybe about 5 or 6 years after I decided that I wanted African culture to be my primary source of inspiration. And so I did this slide presentation, took about an hour or so, and then there was a question and answer period. And there were some of the typical questions, but then there was this one young man, I think he was Canadian, who challenged me that being an American and being a Westerner, what right did I have to adopt or to co-opt the certain aspects of African culture? I wasn't African, And I was really surprised by that question, and my response was somewhat flummoxed because I had never been challenged that way. One of my responses, which I guess was one of anger, was that I find it ironic that you as a white person is taking me to tasks about what, I forget the term he used, but using aspects of a culture that I'm not a part of. And I said, I find it ironic that you as a Westerner, your history is based upon stealing ideas from other cultures. Not only stealing ideas, but stealing their work and stealing their people, and that the fact that you are standing there challenging me when you don't even apparently know your own history. But I said, I have more of a right to utilize, to investigate, to incorporate into my creative activities African culture than someone like Picasso or the other famous Western artists, who used, like Matisse, who used aspects of African sculpture that was a new thing at that particular time. Your history is filled with evidences of, Gauguin going to Tahiti, and living there and stealing all kinds of decorative ideas as well, And so I said, I can understand you questioning that, but I think you need to look at yourself first before you judge someone else, and then part of my response was in anger, and I probably said some things that I shouldn't have said, And I kind of sought him out after that because we still had about a week to go in the workshop, and I tried to sort him out, and he avoided me, and so, so how does a kid, number 3 of 9 children, African American, how do I enter into and use as a source of inspiration the creative work of a culture that I didn't know anything about? Growing up, my idea of an African was someone who ran around with a bone through their nose in a grass skirt, getting their ass kicked by Tarzan. And the way that I was able to enter that and become more curious about it was through that exhibition catalog by William Fagg in the Metropolitan Museum of Nigerian Ceramics. And one of the commonalities I felt was that I too was decorating surfaces. I was decorating ceramic surfaces, but I was decorating them with images of frustration and victimization, And so I started looking at how these Nigerian potters decorated their surfaces. A lot of the patterns were patterns that were passed down through generations of potters. A lot of the patterns had symbolic meanings that I wasn't aware of. And so I was just approaching it not so much as me trying to understand all of the symbolism in the work, but just the visuality of the way in which their patterns either enhanced the form or contradicted the form, and things like that. And so I guess probably the hook that allowed me to continue my investigation was the fact of surface decoration. Then I discovered other African cultures, and the things that I found exciting about them is they decorated everything. All right, and so I started investigating cultures in East Africa, the Maasai, and so on and so forth. And then the cultures in South America, South Africa, the Ndebele and the Zulu people, and the commonality that I found amongst all of them is they took a utilitarian object and they made it more than it was by decorating the surface. And one of the things I love about pattern, one of the kind of miracles, visual miracles that happens for me at least in terms of pattern, is that you can take the most mundane motif, and if it's repeated in a particular way, the end result becomes more than the sum of the parts, and that's the kind of visual magic I enjoy about pattern, and that's the kind of thing I try to incorporate into my work. And so I started looking at other forms of decoration that are African in origin, and textiles, architectural decoration, especially the underbelly women, and body decoration, piercing, hairstyles, scarification, ceremonial decoration that is not permanent. All these things, started energizing my creative engine until the point that I have been completely overwhelmed by the diversity and the multiplicity of the different kinds of decorations and the kinds of things that exist, decorative kinds of things that exist throughout Africa. And so I guess if someone were to ask me to summarize my relationship to African culture through my work, I would have to say it's more about the idea of how decoration makes an object more than it is without it. In other words, how sometimes decoration will make a mundane object become a ceremonial object, an object that has a certain kind of presence, a certain kind of spirituality. So you take a cup, a mug, and you decorate it in such a way that it becomes more than just a mug. It becomes an experience of interacting with it. And that's what I try to create in my work in terms of the carving. A plate is a very simple and minimal form. I mean, it's just basically a disc, but there's that entire uninterrupted surface that is just begging to be filled in some way, and so the idea of decorating the circular space, because most of us artists, don't, especially two-dimensional artists, don't work with circular spaces. I mean, usually the space is rectangular or square or something like that. So just the idea of trying to figure out decoratively things to divide, ways of dividing that space up has always been an interesting challenge for me. And then the notion of working on a three-dimensional object where you only see a part of the pattern at one time. And as you move around the object or the object rotates, you start to see different relationships has always been fascinating to me. And so I guess if I hadn't latched on to African culture, I would have found some other decorative technique or tradition, because basically I just like to decorate surfaces. I remember conversations I had with Mr. Gilliard at Hampton, and he wasn't much of an artist. He would call the people who were making ceramic art, he would call them artsy-fartsy people, and but he was an incredible craftsman, and he really appreciated the technical aspect of ceramics. And he would say, the only reason I make pots is I need a surface to test my glazes on, And now and again, I think the only reason I make pots is to have surfaces that I can decorate.
I went to school in the late 90s, and when I first saw your work, I didn't know where it came from, but I knew how it made me feel. and it made me feel this sense of awe because of the intricate nature of the pattern. So can you talk about how repeating a pattern over and over again, on the same pot, like a motif, how it goes around the pot, how that for you as the maker feels to make that, but then how that maybe what you want the person to get out of it, seeing that?
Well, it's both simple and complex. It's simple in the sense that you put this pattern on the piece to energize the surface, and the pattern can be either of a nature that enhances the quality of the form, or a pattern that kind of tricks the eye in terms of the nature of the form. So that's one level of my interaction with patterns. Sometimes I'm really surprised how a particular pattern that I expected would be complementary to the form actually makes the form look faceted when the form is not faceted. Yeah, and so that's one aspect of a pattern that I find interesting, and somewhat something that I don't intentionally do, but sometimes happens, and I'm surprised by it. And I think one of the reasons why I continue to be excited about getting up in the morning and working in the studio is that I'm going to discover something that I hadn't thought about, and it's going to surprise me. I think one saying that I often use to teach my students, especially the introductory ones, as I said, I would tell them the only thing that, and this is not mine, this is something I heard someone else say, but the only difference between a master and a student is that the master has more pleasant surprises than unpleasant surprises, and you want to get to the point where you have those pleasant surprises. But you really don't want to get to the point where everything becomes so mechanical that you know exactly what's going to happen. All right, and that's one of the pitfalls. But at any rate, especially when you consider the marketplace and what's selling and what's not selling. But at any rate, the other aspect of pattern is how, especially on a flat surface like a plate, how pattern can be used to create the illusion of depth, of how it can make you think that one thing is going behind another. And there's a pattern that I sometimes use, which is a series of spirals that go around the perimeter of the pot, and it looks like the spiral is going behind the next circular spiral next to it, and I like those kinds of illusionary things. I also like the idea that the spaces that I don't carve in, I usually glaze. And depending upon the glaze I use, whether it's a dark glaze or a light glaze or a medium tone glaze like a celadon or something like that, will either push what I consider to be the negative space forward, or it will make the negative space that's not carved recede, and so you get this feeling of the carved elements or ideas kind of floating in space above this background. There are some patterns that I used to use. There's one I still use, and I'm thinking about doing a series of pieces that are based on the Adinkra textile tradition. Some of the symbols that they use. But there is one adinkra symbol that I've used consistently. I even have it on my letterhead and my business cards. This the one that's called the knot of reconciliation, and I like the shape of it, but I also like the symbolic meaning of it as well. And I've used it as a central image on a number of my plates, and I've modified it somewhat, but you can still see that it has that same kind of nature of this endless spiral going around in circles. Okay, so what I'm thinking about doing is figuring out a way of incorporating some of the adinkra symbols that are not like the knot of reconciliation, but I want to try and do it in such a way that when the viewer looks at it initially, if they're familiar with the adinkra tradition and some of the symbols that are used, when the viewer looks at it, they can't see it. All right? In some ways, it's articulated in a way that's not readily apparent. But after looking at it, and your mind starts to try to find some sense of organization. Even, our mind tends to do that. Even in something that's completely abstract, our mind tends to want to organize it into something that is relevant or familiar. All right, and so I want to try to articulate, and I'm thinking about these being mostly on plates. I want to articulate these adinkra symbols in such a way that you only recognize them after looking at the plate for a certain period of time. It's sort of like that hidden image. I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to do that, and I haven't quite figured out which symbols I'm going to use. Some would probably be easier to do than others, but that's the next series of plates I would like to do based upon the adinkra symbols, because I think there's over 200 of them that have different meanings, symbolic meanings, and so I want to pick the ones that have the meanings that I feel are important, like tranquility, peace, harmony, continuity, and see if I can figure out a way of incorporating them into the carved surfaces of my plates. I think that the patterning that I use, some of it is just kind of filler, like around the edge of the plate where I might use that herringbone pattern or something like that. It's just to create a kind of neutral frame for the image, the primary image, which is the cameo in the center of the plate. And then there are some where the cameo image in the center of the plate is not as important as the pattern that I use to frame it. I want that to be more complicated, more involved, more intricate. And so I fluctuate. When I first started carving plates, I would carve the same pattern from one rim to the other, and the piece that the carved plate that's in the collection of the Everson Museum is a prime example of that. And that was back when, I guess, during the mid 70s, when that particular carving technique, I first started using it, maybe the late 70s. And I was just still trying to figure out how the tool worked, what its limitations were. And I was just also trying to figure out, how do I fill this circular space? And so that plate, which I think is about 28 inches in diameter, it compared to the plates that I'm doing now, it's very simplistic, easy to read, although it does create, one of the things I liked about it is that it does create a kind of optical illusion, kind of like a pattern. Like I remember when I was younger and I was watching TV and I was allowed to stay up until the channel signed off in the test pattern.
Totally. Yep.
Oh, I loved those things, and I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the early carving I did was influenced by those test patterns at the end of the broadcast.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. Well, it's funny you say that because there's a vibration to your work that almost feels like those test patterns where there's lines. It's a bigger motif, but there's lines right beside each other that repeat. Mm-hmm. And when I first saw your work, it did this thing to my eyes where it looked like they
vibrated?
Yeah. Yeah, and as a potter, that's so interesting to me because if I think about it, I mean, granted, these are huge platters that most people that buy them are putting them on the wall. They're not necessarily putting a turkey on them.
They're designed to be hung on the wall, and that's an interesting story as well. Yeah. You want me to tell you that story?
Yeah. And I also want you to, after that story, can you compare the way you think? Because the platters are like about, if you're standing right in front of the pot, they're big enough that it fills up your whole periphery.
Yeah.
So you're living in it. Like your perception is living in it. But when you make the large jars, like the ones that are, about probably 4 feet tall, that's different. Like I think about that, like I'm looking at it as if it's outside of me. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about how you think differently about the pattern on the platter versus about the large jar?
Well, I'll talk about that first because otherwise I'll forget. There is no conscious intent that differentiates one from the other, except that the fact that on the three-dimensional, the freestanding pieces, I realized that the pattern can't be seen all at one time. And so basically, you're just seeing kind of one side of it, almost as if it's flat. All right, and that in order to get the full effect, I tried to create a pattern that in some way starts to wrap around the pot, so that you're kind of inclined to wonder where it's going. All right, even though it may be the same, and so I think of those terms, and in some ways, that intent will influence the pattern in the sense it may influence the nature of the pattern. It may the nature of the pattern in terms of the elements of the pattern as well as the scale of the elements. All right, and so if the patterns are relatively, or if the elements of the pattern are relatively large, and you're able to see, let's say, 1/3 of the one that's on the edge beyond your vision, and it kind of forces you to see how it resolves itself. Okay, if the pattern or the motif elements are relatively small, then you get to probably see a complete resolution of the pattern in one view, okay? And so there's less of a tendency to want to walk around it. At least that's my perception. That, in fact, may not be the case for someone who's actually viewing the piece, but that is kind of the notion that I use to determine whether I use a very small, intricate pattern or whether I use a larger pattern as well. For the plates, I've often mentioned that one of the unique things about plates is that unlike a vase or a jar or something like that, you see this complete uninterrupted space. It's circular, and as I had mentioned before, three-dimensional people are accustomed to working with rectangular or square spaces, but a round space is an entirely different animal, and I tend to structure things in that kind of space in what I call a radial symmetry. I mean, there's bilateral symmetry where the left side is a reflection of the right side, But on the plates, I tend to work with radial symmetry, and so I divide the plate up into pie shapes, and then those pie shapes may be further subdivided by concentric circles, and so I know that whoever is looking at this is going to see the entire design at one time. And as you had mentioned, if you get close enough, it kind of envelops you. Although I'm not making plates that large anymore. But at any rate, so the difference, the distinction between the two that I have, at least in terms of my intent. Now, there may be some things subconsciously working that I'm not particularly aware of, but from what I'm conscious of, the difference being that, first of all, the nature of the underlying structure with the freestanding form, it's based on a grid structure that's either a right angle grids or vertical lines intersected by horizontal lines creating squares, or it's a diagonal grid in which the intersecting lines create diamond shape cells. All right, and then the issue is, well, how do I divide these diamond-shaped spaces up in such a way that it creates a pattern? On the plate, the shape of the cells are completely different. They're pie-shaped, all right, and the way in which I organize them in my head is there tend to be a pattern field that surrounds the peripheral part of the space, encircling and framing that central cameo, which the central cameo, though, is not, the structure of that is not based upon the radial grid. It's usually based on the right angle grid, all right, which changes its nature in relationship to what's framing it, and that's something that I don't know when I started doing that, but I think it was an accident, actually, because a lot of the discoveries I make are the result of me backing into something by accident and seeing something that I hadn't intended. And that's why I say my work evolves not revolutionarily, but evolutionarily. That ideas come to me as a result of what I've done before and have made subtle changes in what I had done before. But at any rate, when I decided that I wanted the central image of my plates to be a cameo of some kind of decorative pattern or or element, it became logical to me that and everything I do is based upon a grid in some point. And although it may not wind up looking like a grid. And so it just made sense to me that if I wanted this to be of a certain nature, that the organization has to be different than it is on the framing part, which is usually strongly radially grid structured, So I don't know if that answers your question, but the way in which I got into hanging plates on the wall was the result of a suggestion that Professor Stull made. I was in graduate school, and the graduate students in ceramics had decided to do a protest pottery sale in reaction to the Ann Arbor pottery sale, which was nationally recognized for decades. It was a big deal. And so since we couldn't afford the entry fee, we decided to do a pottery sale on the quad at the University of Michigan. We didn't ask permission to do it. It's always better to ask forgiveness than permission. And so we set up tables and stuff like that at the same time that the Ann Arbor pottery sale was going on. And about that time, I had just started making large plates, and I had a number of large plates on my table. And a lot of people admired them, and they were impressed by the size of them and the way in which I decorated them. At that time, I was just glazing them. But no one bought one. And I mean, they were the size of the plates that I now sell for $1,000. I think I was selling them for $150, And so, at any rate, I was somewhat chagrined, and Professor Stull asked me, well, how'd the sale go? I said, I sold a lot of bowls and cups, but nobody bought any of my platters. I said that there was one person that said they were interested in purchasing something, but they had no place to store it. And so Bob Stull said, what you might think about is telling these people when they're not using them, they can hang them on the wall. And he showed me how to do a hanging system, which is slightly different from what I do now, but so that I could put wire on them and they could be hung on the wall. And I thought that was a very clever idea, and so I started designing all my plates to hang on the wall. But there was this idea that when you have a plate on a horizontal surface, it doesn't have an up and a down or a left and a right. It's on a horizontal surface. But when you start hanging things on the wall, then you have to decide, especially if the designs that you're putting on the plate are not symmetrical, you have to decide which side is up and which side is down. And I could never figure that out, so I designed my plate so that it had 4 holes, or 8 holes actually, so you could hang it in 4 different orientations, And that's the way I did the plates for a long time. But one of the other realizations I came to, that my relationship to these plates changed, or my perception of them changed, when the fact that now I could hang them on the wall, and so they became something different. My relationship to them became more about using them as a tablet, so to speak, for ideas, as opposed to a functional object, or utilitarian object. And so my attitude towards my plates changed. I started when I started using images that were related to my political and social commentary, I started putting those images on it. And so the plates I started relating to them initially, not as an afterthought, but initially as they were going to hang on the wall. And so it's interesting to me, in hindsight, how something as simple as that, which was primarily a way of solving a storage problem, became an important part of the aesthetics of the object that I was making. And so now when I make plates, I don't put 8 holes in them. I decide which side is up and which side is down, but I'm looking at them as in terms of how they're going to hang on the wall. And in some ways that controls the shape of the plate because it determines how deep or or shallow the plate is, and some people have complained, well, these things are not plates, they're actually shallow bowls. Well, when does a bowl begin and a plate end? So I poo-poo those people, at any rate. But that's how the whole idea of making plates and hanging them on the wall evolved, quite by trying to solve a storage problem to make the plates more attractive to people who were going to buy them. We back into things, and the important things. Like I said earlier, the difference between a master and a student is the kind of surprise you get, but it's also the difference is how do you use things that you accidentally encounter, how you're able to incorporate them, or how you're allowed to use them to influence the trajectory of your work.
One of the things I wanted to wrap up our interview talking about is how you've been able to consciously and unconsciously put the spirituality that you believe in and experience into the work. One of the things I've heard you talk about last night in the lecture was how ritual-based objects, ritual-based ideas, the act of the ritual is spiritual. So therefore, the ritual puts it into the pot. Mm-hmm. But I have a feeling that came later. I'm sure there was some sense within you as the maker that there was something bigger going on in the work. Or maybe this is the question. When did you realize that pots could be a vessel for something spiritual?
I guess, although I wasn't particularly aware of it, I guess in hindsight, that was when Mom took out the good china. When she took out the good china, which was usually Thanksgiving or something like that, I knew that there was going to be something special happening. There was going to be an event that everybody looked forward to, that had a particular kind of importance and symbolism, and so I think the point at which I actually saw, especially the functional work that I was making, that I actually realized that even though I wasn't necessarily looking at the stuff that I was making as being part of a ritual and being ceremonial, other people were. And I was in a local mall in Syracuse. This is probably maybe the mid-'70s or something like that, maybe a little earlier. And I had just joined the faculty at Syracuse, and me and my wife and my older son in a stroller, we were walking through the mall. My wife loved to walk through the mall and window shop, and so I would tag along with her. And this woman came up to us and asked if I was David MacDonald. And my first reaction was, do I owe this person money or something, or is she going to complain to me about something? And I hesitantly said, yes, I am. And my wife said, well, can we help you? And she said, oh, I just want to thank your husband for making a mug that I use every morning for my first cup of coffee. And that I really look forward to using it. And it's a very special object to me. And that was when I realized that people were relating to the work that I made on a different level than I was conscious of. I enjoyed making the object. I enjoyed making it well so that it fit what was the contemporary standard for excellence, or was close to it, but I never thought that of these objects as having a life after they leave me. And so when this woman approached us and said that this cup that I made, which I don't remember making because I was making hundreds of them, was a very special object to her, and that it was part of her daily ritual. And then I started realizing that first of all, the objects that I make do have a life after they leave me, and secondly, that life becomes part of a ritual of someone's life. And hopefully a positive one, and not one where when they try to drink coffee from it, it dribbles down the side of their face, And so that's when I started looking at my strictly utilitarian work in a different way. Started seeing this cup as a vessel that contains more than just a liquid. It contains more than just coffee or tea or white wine or whatever. It contains the essence of a ritual which people perform one way or another, sometimes on very special occasions, sometimes very, very ordinarily, mundanely every day, and so at least in terms of my functional work, I wanted it to have that kind of quality about it. And then as I started making large, as academia required exhibitions and such, and I started making larger work, a work that you couldn't drink coffee from, I started thinking about the idea of ritual, the idea of ceremony, and there was a whole series of hand-built forms that I made, and I'm as a matter of fact, I'm planning to go back to that series, and hopefully I'll have one or two of them done for the old church pottery sale in December. But they were called the ceremonial bowls, and I wanted to make an object that had a kind of ancient quality to it. One of the things about glazes is that they look new all the time. They don't age unless it's a glaze that a cup that you drink coffee out of, and the crazing cracks, form, and then they start to get stained. But usually a glazed object looks the same, and I wanted to make it a series of objects that looked like they were old and had been used. And so I made these ceremonial bowls. They stood about 20 inches high, and I made them out of earthenware clay. I I coated them with a terra sigillata, and then I pit fired them. So they weren't really designed to be used. They were designed to be more decorative than anything. And those I called my ceremonial bowls. And then there was a series of stoneware pieces that I made, which I called my divination plates. And they were kind of built upon the idea of, in certain African culture, there are these individuals that have the gift of foretelling the future based upon the position of bones and rocks that are thrown into these special plate-like forms, And so I did a series of pieces. As a matter of fact, I threw the beginning of one yesterday during the demo, because I'm planning on visiting that series again as well. But those were high-fired, and so the idea of making pieces that are not designed to be used every day, but are designed to be used on very special occasions in special situations, has been a fascination for me in recent years, a conscious fascination for me in recent years, of trying to create objects that may or may not. I mean, if this piece winds up in a museum, it's not going to be, used at all, But the idea, the sense, the feeling of the object that I'm trying to create has to do with that dimension of our consciousness that is not physical, that is not embodied in a physical form, but nonetheless is quite real. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself to be a religious person in terms of, following to the letter a particular religious philosophy, but I do believe that there are things that influence our consciousness. I don't know if it's some force, somebody sitting up on a throne up in heaven, which I think is a kind of superstitious notion. But I think there is an aspect of consciousness that we're only relatively recently becoming aware of, and there's some experimentation in terms of trying to measure it that is not physical, that's not tangible, but it does have an effect on our tangible life, and I guess religion is one way that has been tried to be interpreted, but I think, like most things that man encounters, it's been corrupted. And so I go to church. Because I believe that there is a way that you should treat people and a way that you should want to be treated. And that's what I primarily get from church, is the idea, the simple command or notion of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's also the idea that I've been blessed in my life. I didn't get to where I am solely by my efforts. As a matter of fact, probably most of the success that I've achieved is a result of people believing in me and believing what I had to offer had some value. And I believe in the admonition in the Bible that to whom much is given, much is required. And so that's been the guiding axiom in my life, that I didn't get here solely by my efforts. And there are a lot of people that made sacrifices for me to be where I am with no intent of benefiting from that action, and so who am I to say that, I don't owe anybody anything. I owe everybody everything. And so that's my philosophy.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. It was good to spend some time with you this morning. I appreciate it.
Well, I thank you for taking your time to seek me out and to also ask me some very interesting and provocative questions, some of which I'm going to probably be thinking about on my 12-hour drive back to Syracuse, So thank you.
I'd like to thank David for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with him, and I really appreciate that he gave me extra time as we got to delve deep into his career. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Monkey Stuff, the Rosenfield collection of functional ceramic art, and Cornell Studio Supply. If you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at talesofaredclayrambler.com. I'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.